I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life.
Political Philosophy, Dr. Laurie Johnson, is a Maurin Academy podcast. So I am coming to the end of my discussion of Federalist 10, written by James Madison, which you can now find in the Federalist papers. And all of this is totally available online. I'm using, I should have said this before, but I'm using the Avalon Project, which is a Yale Law project, to put this Federalist paper up on the screen. So great service there. But you can find the Federalist papers at Project Gutenberg and this place and a whole lot of other places. So you don't have to buy it as a book, although I have one for sure. All right. So we're at the last three paragraphs of this Federalist paper written by Madison, dealing with the threat posed to democracies of the majority, the violent majority faction that pursues a special interest of the majority to basically collude and use violence in order to suppress the rights of minorities and ignore the common good. So implicit in this is the idea that you can't have a democracy for long if people in it are not capable of thinking about the common good, even the good of people that they disagree with or that they are unlike. And Madison, in thinking about how to build the new Constitution, which is the Constitution we still have today, wanted to do his best to proof it against especially majority factions and demagogues. So he says at the end here, hence it clearly appears that the same advantage which a republic has over a democracy in controlling the effects of faction is enjoyed by a large over a small republic, is enjoyed by the union over the states composing it. Does the advantage consist in the substitution of representatives whose enlightened views and virtuous sentiment render them superior to local prejudices and schemes of injustice? He's reiterating here, first of all, that a republic does have an advantage over a democracy in controlling the effects of faction, which means that a representative type of democracy has an advantage over a pure democracy in this regard. And part of the reason why is because it allows for you to have a large as opposed to a small republic, and the large republic gives less ability for large majority factions to even form to begin with, because there are so many more interests being represented. But also, even if it forms, preventing it from form in a way that leads to real direct collusion in order to bring about the singular focus, the singular goals of a majority faction. So he's here, of course, advocating for the union, the federal type of government that our Constitution represents over the states. That would be, a reference to the relative power of the states in the previous Constitution, which they rejected eventually, the Articles of Confederation. So the Union is superior to that in his view because of the strengths that come from this larger, more diffuse type of government, where, power and interests are more diffused and spread out. And then he asks this question: does the advantage consist in the substitution of representatives whose enlightened views and virtuous sentiments render them superior to the local prejudices and schemes of injustice? So the question here is at least part of the advantage, or the main advantage, that if we elect representatives, they will be more enlightened and virtuous, and therefore above, the petty squabbles or the petty interests of the more local, people who are very interested in their local advantage somehow, whether it be an industry or a way of life or a religion or whatever. And to this, he says, it will not be denied that the representation of the Union will be most likely to possess these requisite endowments. I'm not going to deny that the new Constitution does have that quality, and that probably it would be more likely to elect people that have more enlightened views and virtuous sentiments. Okay. And then he says, does it consist in the greater security afforded by a greater variety of parties against the event of any one party being able to outnumber and oppress the rest? Is part of the advantage, in other words, that the bigger the country, the greater the variety of parties, so it'll be harder for any one of them to become predominant and represent a majority faction. And he says, in an equal degree, does the increased variety of parties comprised within the Union increase its security? That's another question, right? But it's related. Are we more secure if we have more of a variety of parties rather than one or two, or a very small number where this majority faction can form? Okay. And he says, does it finally consist in the greater obstacles opposed to the concert and accomplishment of the secret wishes of an unjust and interested majority? In other words, does the advantage of the Union also circle around the obstacles to like collusion and, more or less corruption of an interested majority, right? And here again, he says the extent of the Union gives it the most palpable advantage. So yes, to all those questions, yes, it has all those advantages. It is far better than a pure democracy, which must be small, and it's far better than a small republic as well. The extent of this Union and its federal character, which makes it possible to extend all the way from coast to coast, eventually, gives it all these advantages. Okay, so he's saying yes to all that, really, ending this with the most positive, sort of forceful, endorsement. And he says, the influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration through the other states. Now, this is where, probably correct back in those times when it was so difficult for people to communicate. They literally had to travel or write letters, and, which took like weeks, if not months, maybe, to get someplace. So, he's asking, or he's saying that in his view, factious leaders, with designs to like create divisions and to gain advantage, probably be more successful within a state, and be able to maybe even dominate that state, but probably would not be able to start a fire. That's why that means light a fire that spreads throughout the other states. So I think, times have changed and it's a little easier to do that. He says a religious sect, basically a type of religion, may degenerate into a political faction in a part of the Confederacy, but the variety of sects dispersed over the face of it must secure the national councils against any danger from that source. So he's addressing the danger of a religion, a particular brand of Christianity, probably is what he's thinking of, or some other religion. It could degenerate into a political faction. Okay. So I think that's interesting right there, because he's not saying that religions are necessarily political factions, but that they may, quote, degenerate into political factions. Okay. Which I guess we probably have to admit that we've seen in the United States, the religious sects, churches of a variety of sorts have degenerated into political factions in our union. But he says he thinks that the variety of sects dispersed over the entire face of the country would make it difficult for a particular factious sect of religion to threaten the whole country. Okay, so again, kind of like the first sentence there, probably a lot more true back in the 18th and even 19th century than now. Probably the biggest difference is that of media, and I don't mean just social media, but even the ability of people to get that national news almost instantaneously. A phenomenon that probably started in the probably the 50s and 60s with radio, and then with, I think USA Today, the first national newspaper, and then the rise of the internet, and now all of that, and social media, something that the founders, somebody like Madison, just wouldn't have been able to imagine. All right, so then he says, a rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it. Yeah, like that's probably a reference, at least some of this is a reference to Shays' Rebellion. And you've got a reference there to people who might want some sort of socialism. Shays' Rebellion happened in the years 1786 to 1787, was led by Daniel Shays, and he organized farmers, many of whom were former soldiers, and they seized court buildings and closed debtors' prisons and kind of threatened the economic arrangements in Massachusetts. So he's no doubt thinking of this. And he's saying that, movements like that might shake a state, but would not be able to gain enough traction in a federal government to change the arrangements, whether it's for the abolition of debts or for equal distribution of property or any, quote, improper or wicked project. And the reference to paper money may be odd, but way back then, he was wondering whether the introduction of paper money that represented gold and silver coins would be as trustworthy. They weren't there yet. All right. And then he says, in the same proportion as such a malady is more likely to taint a particular county or district than an entire state. Yeah. All right. So again, this is very much about, he thinks the bigness of the Union will prevent these types of what he considers to be kind of radical or squirrely or, fanatical ideas, or, some flare up of anger in a particular place from spreading like wildfire throughout the rest of the country, because people just aren't going to be able to like vibe with that in other places. So finally, he says, in the extent and proper structure of the Union, therefore, we behold a Republican remedy for the diseases most incident to Republican government. And according to the degree of pleasure and pride we feel in being Republicans, ought to be our zeal in cherishing the spirit and support supporting the character of Federalists. So there's his rousing ending. Again, championing the large republic, being very clear about preferring Republican, which is, again, representative democracy or liberal democracy that can, control a large territory. He thinks that this is the best possible solution to the dangers involved, especially with democracies and smaller republics. And he rouses a sense of pride in being Republican in nature. And in doing so, kind of ends on a positive note, a sort of call to action. Join us. We are obviously right, and we should feel proud about it. All right. So just like one takeaway that I have gotten from going back through Federalist 10 is that this one ingredient, which we have, again, just not to belabor too much, but this one ingredient of immediate communication may be combined with mass schooling and an economy that Madison could have never imagined, which tends to make most people live as though they are very small cogs in a big machine. In other words, our economy encourages massification. Our media encourages massification. Our education, which is mainly designed to create cogs in a machine, encourages massification. And a mass of people, which no longer largely thinks for itself, and which can communicate freely and instantaneously across the large extent of our republic, which is no longer large in that sense, but very small in that sense. It kind of erases some of the benefit that Madison thought we got from a large land area. It does. All of that does. So that makes the logic behind the Constitution a little bit more precarious, a little bit more fragile. All the more reason why people need to understand what they were concerned about. They were concerned about basically the democracy, the people's power being taken over by special interests of some kind. And in this case, he's talking about the development of a majority faction, a violent majority faction, which oppresses the interests of other people, which usually comes about because of ambitious leaders who seek to kind of create a powerful faction to wield that power and control for themselves. They were very concerned about that because, of course, they came from a monarchy, right? They ultimately rejected through war the monarchy of England, and so they did not want to have a popular king. That was way scarier even than a hereditary king, right? And they did not want to have any more of these grabs for power that would take away the freedom and liberty of people. They came to this country for the freedom. And yes, they had many faults, but as far as understanding their motivations, they wanted freedom more than anything else, it seems to me. And we're very, very suspicious of anything that would curtail people's freedom. So this ends my reading and discussion of Federalist 10. And my next will be Federalist 51. And that adds even more insight into what the founders were concerned about. So please support the Maurin Academy. And this podcast is a part of it. This program on YouTube is a part of it. pmaurin.org. We have a Patreon. That's the best way to support us. Just look for the Maurin Academy, Maurin Academy on Patreon, and you can join at 3 levels. There's a $1 level that will give you access to a couple of our reading groups and one-stop place for all of our stuff. And then we have like a $5 level where you can get some things live, including our check-ins and my monthly reading group, other monthly reading groups, and everything we do, classes, reading groups, everything we do, including our TMA lecture series, recorded. And then at the $10 level, the worker scholar level, you get everything live and you get to interact with our speakers, interact in our courses and seminars, and of course, in our reading groups. So, all right. Thank you and see you next time.